So we have 9 papers being presented here, and the first person to present is uh, Dr. K. Chandrasekhar Reddy from SWIMS, Tirupati. Hello,
Yes, sir, I am here.
Dr. Chandrasekhar, can you please switch on your video?
Yes,
Yeah. I think you need to share your screen.
yes,
The time duration is total 10 minutes, 8 minutes for your talk and 2 minutes for the questions.
yes, sir.
Thank you.
Can you see my screen, sir?
Yeah, I'm able to see.
Chandrasekhar, yeah, good morning, and then go ahead with your paper.
Yes, 1 minute. So, can you see my screen, sir? I'm starting. Sir.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, we can see. Yes.
Thank you, sir. So, my name is Dr. Chandrasekhar Reddy. I'm from SWIMS Neurosurgery Department, and today my paper is about surgical preference in colloid cyst, a 40 case series, sir, which we retrospectively analyzed that were done in SWIMS from 2008 to 2020. And my guides were Dr. BCM Prasad sir and Dr. VV Ramesh Chandra sir, Department of Neurosurgery. Colloid cyst are rare histologically benign lesions. Sir. These may result in obstructive hydrocephalus and sudden death. Colloid cysts make up between 0.5 to 2% of brain tumors, and though they are very little in number, their understanding is important because they lead to sudden death due to cardiac arrest or sudden increase in hydrocephalus. In spite of their rarity, colloid cysts are one of the interesting cerebral tumors that are curable yet potentially fatal. Historically, it's thought that colloid cysts are parasites, a rudimentary embryonic structure in the roof of third ventricle. But the recent studies suggest that they are of endodermal origin, usually of pulmonary. And the risk factors are mainly of obstructive hydrocephalus, and they remain poorly defined. There are no grading scales which will help to develop the standard management strategies. The presentation is significant number of cases of emergency condition masks their risk stratification. So most of the cases present with emergency and drop the risk stratification will be difficult. Based on the previous studies, over 50% of the patients with colloid cysts of the third level are symptomatic at the time of diagnosis and ultimately undergo neurosurgical intervention. Most of these patients present with symptoms of hydrocephalus and raised ICP, including headache, nausea, vomiting, blurred vision, gait ataxia, and cognitive decline. Notably, a small portion of the symptomatic patients present with acute obstructive hydrocephalus and progress to death despite the rapid of diversive doses. Uh, Estimates of the risk of rapid clinical deterioration due to acute hydrocephalus in patients with colloids vary widely from 3 to 35% and associated with 5 to 38% risk of death. Since the chance of death is between 5 to 38%, it's better to go with the surgical option even though they present in asymptomatic manner. Historically, yeah, these patients were often described as having experienced sudden deterioration and death, but several more recent studies using modern neuroimaging techniques have demonstrated that nearly all patients with acute obstructive hydrocephalus have progressive symptoms preceding precipitous clinical deterioration. Potential exceptions are the rare instances of acute intralesional hemorrhage or cyst apoplexy. Incomplete understanding of the natural history of colloids of third ventricle has impeded efforts to establish advanced evidence-based prognostic factors and surgical indications, particularly for asymptomatic patients with incidentally discovered lesions who are often lost to follow-up. Early studies of the colloid cyst are focused on demographic characters, presenting symptoms, and cyst diameter in an attempt to identify the patients at risk for rapid deterioration and death. But the recent studies with the development of MRI in CT, most of the asymptomatic patients are also being diagnosed. Actually, not in India, but most of the foreign countries. In India, still the presentation is in acute state where they are found on first CT scan. Most of the studies focused on managing the patients with colloid cysts of more than 8 mm in diameter. And the presentation, if they are present initially with hydrocephalus and raised ICP features, shunting is done, followed by surgical excision of the tumor. Two consecutive studies from Mayo Clinic have provided several key insights. Importantly, the 10-year incidence of cyst-related symptoms in asymptomatic patients undergoing follow-up with serial imaging was 8%, with only 2 patients demonstrating cyst enlargement, one of whom also developed progressive ventriculomegaly and underwent resection of the lesion. Although several surgical case series corroborate these findings, objective prognostic criteria for patients with colloid cysts remains undefined, leaving surgical decision making to the individual clinician judgment. Here we report a retrospective review of 40 patients treated for colloid cysts of the third ventricle at SWIMS Tirupati between 2008 and 2020, and their management based on size, radiology, and presentations. The aims and object of my study is to discuss the presentation, diagnosis, treatment plan, management, and prognosis of third ventricle colloid cyst. We performed a retrospective review of all cases of third ventricle colloid cyst admitted and operated in Department of Neurosurgery. 40 cases were identified using the department database. The patients' records were segregated and tabulated for gender, signs and symptoms, and visual disturbances, gait abnormalities, altered sensorium, seizures, urinary incontinence, etc. The radiological findings we take into consideration were the cyst location, cyst diameter, cyst volume, signal intensity on several MRI sequences, and CT appearance and presence or absence of hydrocephalus, and the surgical procedure and the outcome of the patient. All the data was tabulated in Microsoft Excel 2010 datasheet under various headings. Data was expressed as mean and frequency tables. Statistical analysis were performed using Microsoft Excel spreadsheets and SPSS for Windows version 20. The CT scan of a patient with hydrocephalus and colloid cyst presenting with hydrocephalus. There is a hyperdense lesion in the third ventricle. These are the MRI images, T1 and T2 weighted images, where it is hyperintense on T1 and hyperintense on T2. The contrast imaging and sagittal imaging of colloid cysts of the same patient. The results of our study, the demographic characters, the total number of patients in our study were 40, with a male to female ratio is 5:3. The average age of patients in our study was 31.74 years, and number of patients less than the age of 65 years was 100% in our study. So most of the patients, almost all of the patients in our study were less than 65 years of age. And there is a sex distribution. 25 patients were male and 15 patients were female. This is a age distribution curve, sir. And clinical characters. Most of the common symptoms in our study group was headache. Most people presented with headache and followed by nausea and vomiting in 80%. This is the detailed charting of the symptoms of the patients who presented to us. Most common symptom was headache, which is present in 40 out of 40 patients, and vomiting, which is present in 32 patients. The visual symptoms and blurring of vision, visual in 55%, gait disturbance in 40% people, and syncopal attacks in 30%, and seizure in 12.5% of patients, and dizziness in 32.5%, cognitive and memory decline in 10% of patients, urinary incontinence in 20%, and limb weakness in 17.5% patients, and seventh nerve involvement was present in 12.5% of the patients. This is a detailed tabulated form of the symptoms. Radiological characters. The CT features, most of the people presented with obstructive hydrocephalus features with the ventriculomegaly, and it was present in 70%, and acute hydrocephalus was present in 32.5% of the patients, and CT was hyperattenuating in 85% of the patients. MRI features, the increased T1 signal T1 was present in 75% cases, and increased signal T2 was present in 46.242% of the patients, and increased signal flare was present in 78.57% of the patients. Contrast enhancement was present in 39.28% of the patients. The mean cyst diameter in our study was 11.96 mm, and cyst diameter more than 1 centimeter was present in 75%. The mean cyst volume is 1922.6 millimeter cube. And this is a tabulated form of the patient with both radiological and CT and MRI features and based on size and signal intensities. Pathological characters, almost all cysts, 80% contain firm mucoid or gelatinous material. In 2 cases, there is a solid component, and in 5 cases, the contents were completely liquids. 1 cyst was calcified, and in none of the cases, the contents were suggestive of hemorrhage. And histopathology, all the 40 cases were confirmed to be colloid cyst on histopathology, and most of the histopathological features are suggestive of epithelial lining of the cyst, that is columnar, cuboidal, and some specimens also showed cilia and goblet cells and microvilli, which are suggestive of respiratory origin of the colloid cyst. The pathological characters, most of them are mucoids. Management, the colloid cyst management was started in 1858 by William Mann. First reported the colloid cyst, and in 1921 Dandy accomplished the first successful resection of colloid cyst to transcortical transventricular approach, and since then many different approaches have been developed. Freehand aspiration of colloid cyst was performed by Gutierrez-Lara et al. In 1975, and the first stereotactic aspiration of colloid cyst was performed in 1978 by Bosch et al. The endoscopic aspiration of colloid cyst was reported by Powell in 1983 and has been progressively gained conscience as self-alternative treatment. In our institute, we feel that all symptomatic colloid cysts should be removed. In the study journey in our institute, the CSF diversion procedure should be considered the primary importance in any case which presents with hydrocephalus. Acute cases, the CSF diversion has to be the first step, followed by further management, that is excision of the tumor, which can be either transcortical or transcallosal or endoscopic. Reports and recommendations of stereotactic aspiration are there, but failure rate is up to 90%. Microsurgery is the current gold standard for colloid cyst treatment, but endoscopy is taking up this microsurgery. Transcallosal approach is through natural tissue planes, but there is a risk of retraction damage to the bridging veins and damage to the fornix as it runs around the foramen of Monro. The transcortical approach is direct trajectory through the foramen of Monro, but there is supposedly an increased risk of seizure disorders. The newest report.
I request all the speakers to stick on the time, please.
The newest reported treatment, almost completed, sir. My final findings were, sir, of all the patients, 2 underwent followed by excision. 7 patients underwent EVD, sir. And the surgery we have done here is most of the patients with colloid cysts, 19 patients underwent transcortical approach, 14 patients underwent transcallosal approach, and 7 patients underwent endoscopic approach. Sir. The common complication faced were hydrocephalus, CSF leak, and meningitis, and no complications was noted in endoscopic approach. No recurrence was noted in either of the procedures. These are diagrams showing the treatment.
I request all the speakers to stick on the time, please. Dr. Chandrasekhar Reddy.
Yes. Finished, sir. Almost. These are the images of first one is the transcortical approach, sir, where patient presented with hydrocephalus, intra positioning, and the final CT of post-op CT, sir. This is a transcallosal approach where the patient presented without ventriculomegaly. This is and the post-op CT, sir. Morbidity and mortality, the complications were less with endoscopic procedure, sir. Sir, I want to conclude, sir. This is the basic algorithm we are following in SWIMS, sir. Any patient presenting with colloid cyst and with obstructive features has to immediately go CSF diversion procedures followed by surgery, sir. The surgery can be either transcortical, transcallosal, or endoscopic surgery based on the imaging, sir. If the cyst is small and suckable, we'll go with microscopic excision. If there is a ventriculomegaly in microscopic excision, if the cyst is small, with ventriculomegaly, you can go with transcortical, and if there is absence of ventriculomegaly, we'll go with transcallosal. And if the cyst is large and suckable, endoscopic surgery is preferable. So if we find it as an incidental finding, and if the size of the cyst is less than 1 centimeter, we can go with observation with serial imaging. So if there is an increase in size or patient is symptomatic, we can go with surgery, sir. And if the size of the lesion is more, cyst is more than 1 centimeter, and patient is fit for surgery, we'll follow this algorithm. And if the size of the lesion is more than 1 centimeter and not fit for surgery, stereotactic is preferred, sir. This is a basic algorithm we are following in SWIMS.
Chandrasekhar, you done your paper?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So now the paper is open for discussion. Any questions from audience?
Mr. Chandrasekhar, how many of your patients presented with drop attacks?
Sir, 35%, sir. 7 people presented with drop attacks.
Amit, comments?
Are there any patients with spontaneous resolution of the colloid cyst?
No, sir. Most of the patients were presented with 100% of our patients presented with symptomatic, sir. So everybody went with surgery, sir. There is no conservative treatment that has been done here.
Yeah, you have shown it in your scan. That's the reason.
Yeah, nowadays endoscope is taking over the microscope surgery, and then endoscope is the best tool for this colloid cyst excision. And sometimes you may not be able to excise a total tumor cyst wall, and you can leave the part of the cyst wall which is adherent to the vessels. That will be sufficient, I think.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you, Chandrasekhar.
Thank you.
And we will move on to the second paper. And
let the speakers please maintain the time.
Is there any possibility of putting the timer on the screen?
Yeah, that's not being possible. We'll give a note when the time is up. Actually, 8 minutes time.
8. Okay. 8 plus 1 or
8 plus 2.
8 plus.
Okay.
Shall I start, sir?
Yeah, please
Yeah,
start.
Gautam.
Dr. Gautam.
A very good morning to one and all, sir. I am going to present my paper, a comparative study between oblique lumbar interbody fusion OLIF and minimally invasive transforaminal lumbar interbody fusion MIST-LIF for lumbar spondylolisthesis, a randomized controlled trial. Spondylolisthesis has been defined as forward slippage of one vertebral body with respect to one beneath it, and the treatment has evolved from simple decompressive laminectomy alone to lumbar interbody fusion. And various minimally invasive techniques have evolved over the time, and among which OLIF and MIST-LIF have been more superior in view of minimally invasiveness and less blood loss among the others. That's the reason why we have chosen these two procedures to compare in a prospective way. The advantages of MIST-LIF are that it is the only posterior-only approach. There is no dural retraction, and there is minimal injury to the paraspinal muscles compared to an open procedure. And the decompression it achieves is direct, and there is very minimal blood loss. In OLIF, it also allows deformity correction and also achieves a reduction of listhesis, and it achieves a higher fusion rates compared to MIST-LIF in the previous studies. And as being minimally invasive, there is very minimal blood loss. There are various studies published comparing these two procedures. One study by Lin et al. Has shown that OLIF has very less blood loss, shorter operative time, better restoration of disc height and foraminal height compared to MIST-LIF. In another study by Sheng et al. Has shown that patients have preferred OLIF compared to MIST-LIF in view of better satisfaction rate. And other study by Kauke et al. Has shown that the quality of life parameters were similar in both these groups, but patients have preferred OLIF in view of superiority in the psychological domain in their assessment. All these being the retrospective studies, we want to assess prospectively the clinical and radiological outcomes between these two groups. And the primary outcomes were intraoperative blood loss, Auspicic Disability Index scores. And the secondary outcomes which we wanted to study were duration of surgery, intraoperative radiation exposure, hospital stay, analgesic dependency, muscle injury marker elevation, fusion rates and complication rate. This is a prospective randomized trial started from May 2018 and conducted up to July 2019, and it has been started after taking institution ethical committee approval. And this trial is also registered in Clinical Trials Register of India. And taking 30 ml of difference is blood loss between the two groups, we have achieved 56 patients as the sample size with 28 patients in each group. And patients who are 18 to 60 years of age group with single level grade 1 or 2 listhesis who are not improving on 6 months of conservative treatment were included in the study. And those with high grade listhesis and severe canal stenosis and those other than L4 in L5S1 levels were excluded from the study. And the randomization was generated using a computer generated set of random numbers, and the treatment was allocated to by an opaque seal envelope method after explaining the pros and cons of each visit to all the patients. And minimum period of 6 months of follow-up was maintained for all the groups, and clinical findings, VAS and ODS scores were assessed pre and post-operatively. All patients were subjected to dynamic lumbar X-rays and whole spine X-rays, standing views, both AP and lateral. And spinopelvic alignment was checked pre-operatively and on post-op day 2, first month follow-up and 6 months follow-up. And muscle enzyme markers level were assessed pre-operatively and post-op day 1. And intraoperative radiation exposure was measured with the use of infradose dosimeter. These are the key steps which we followed in the OLIF. Patient will be positioned in the right lateral position initially, and the skin incision will be marked based on CM level. And through a retroperitoneal space corridor, we directly enter into near the disc space of desired level, and discectomy will be done. Following which, interbody bone graft with interbody cage with autologous bone graft harvested from iliac crest will be inserted using an orthogonal maneuver, and the skin incision will be closed, and the patient will be again turned prone, and a percutaneous pedicle screw fixation will be done from the posterior aspect. These are the key steps which we followed in VIST-ELIF. Patient will be turned prone, and the contralateral side of the symptomatic area will be first pedicle screws will be placed, following which the ipsilateral side facetectomy and discectomy will be done, following which the interbody cage filled with autologous bone graft will be inserted, and ipsilateral percutaneous pedicle screws will be placed, and skin incisions will be closed. These are the among the preoperative parameters, both groups are almost having similar parameters, and there is no difference between OLIF group and VIST-ELIF group, and both are comparable. Among the intraoperative parameters, the duration of surgery is longer in OLIF and compared to VIST-ELIF, and the estimated blood loss is also lower in OLIF compared to VIST-ELIF, and both are statistically significant. But the radiation exposure, though, is more in OLIF compared to VIST-ELIF, it is not statistically significant. Among the postoperative parameters, the elevation of muscle enzyme markers is slightly higher in VIST-ELIF, but is not statistically significant. And the mean increase in the foraminal height and disc height is similar in both the groups in our study. Patients who underwent OLIF have returned to regular work earlier compared to VIST-ELIF. And patients who underwent OLIF had a lesser duration of requirement of analysis compared to VIST-ELIF. And these are the representative images of the patients who underwent OLIF and VIST-ELIF. The upper row shows adequate increase in foraminal height and disc height following the OLIF. And the lower images show that increase in foraminal height and disc height following VIST-ELIF. Among the VAS and ODS scores, there is an early improvement in the VAS and ODS scores at the first month follow-up among patients who underwent OLIF compared to those who underwent VIST-ELIF. But at 6 months follow-up, the improvement in VAS and ODS scores is similar in both the groups. And the increase in the lumbar lordosis is better in OLIF with a mean increase of 5 degrees among those who underwent OLIF compared to VIST-ELIF. And the patients who underwent OLIF had lumbar lordosis within 10 degrees of pelvic incidence among OLIF more than among those in the VIST-ELIF, and the difference is statistically significant. And these are the representative images of the whole spine studies which we have done among OLIF, which showed an improvement in lumbar lordosis and spinopelvic alignment correction following OLIF. And these are the representative images of the whole spine studies after following VIST-ELIF. And among the complications, discitis is noted in one group, in one patient in each group, and the case subsidence is noted in one patient in OLIF, and screw medialization was noted in one patient in VIST-ELIF, and postoperative bowel ileus was noted in one patient in OLIF. Lumbar interbody fusion aims at correcting segmental instability, decompressing neural elements, and maintaining spinopelvic alignment with minimal damage to the adjacent structures. And OLIF achieves it indirect decompression by placing a large footprint cage and having an adequate disc space clearance. Whereas in mistelif, there is a direct decompression by facetectomy, and if necessary, under laminectomy can be done through the same incision. These are the representative images. The upper row shows improvement in the canal stenosis following OLIF by indirect decompression, and we can see that the correction of the ligamentum flavum buccalic following OLIF. And in the lower images show pre and post-operative images of lumbar canal stenosis following mistelif, where lumbar canal stenosis can be corrected by direct decompression. The duration of surgery of OLIF in mistelif were comparable with other studies, and it could be attributed due to the time taken to adjust C-arm and operative microscope, time taken to harvest the iliac bone graft, and time taken for changing the position from lateral position to prone position. And Clement Silvestre et al. Has hypothesized that if microscope can be avoided while doing OLIF, and if we can use only bone graft, only bone substitute, then the duration of surgery can be reduced. But in our experience, we have seen that using of demineralized bone matrix and usage of OLIF PIVOX technique has reduced the duration of OLIF drastically. Coming to the blood loss, mistelif has more blood loss compared to OLIF in view of facetectomy and muscle dissection, which is not there in mistelif. And the radiation exposure is slightly longer in OLIF compared to mistelif because of the more number of steps in OLIF compared to mistelif, but the difference is not statistically significant. And the muscle enzyme markers, though, is slightly elevated in mistelif owing to the muscle dissection, but it is not statistically significant different from the OLIF. And the increase in the foramen height and disc height was similar in both the groups, which is in contrary to the other studies among the retrospective analysis of other studies. And but the mean increase in the anterior disc height is better in OLIF compared to the posterior disc height, which might be responsible for the improvement in the lumbar lordosis, which is almost a mean of 5 degrees. And patients with lumbar lordosis were within 10 degrees of pelvic incidence in 32% of patients in OLIF compared to mistelif in preoperative, and it has increased to 78% in OLIF and 50% in mistelif. This might be the reason for the early improvement of VAS and ODS scores in the first month follow-up of OLIF compared to mistelif. And the grade of fusion could not be concluded from this study.
Dr. Gautam, time is up. Please conclude.
These are my conclusions. The estimated blood loss in OLIF is lower than mistelif, and better spinopelvic alignment can be achieved in OLIF than mistelif. And shorter duration of postoperative analysis and early return to work is noted in OLIF. Thus, though both OLIF and mistelif had almost equivalent outcomes, OLIF is better than mistelif in some of these parameters, making it safe and effective. These are my references, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
So Gautam, it's a good paper.
Thanks.
And I think we are running late, and then no questions for this paper, I think. Any questions? Okay, we'll move on to the third paper.
Shanmugapati. Dr. Shanmugapati. Yeah. Please share your screen. Okay, thank you.
Good morning, respected chairpersons. I'm Dr. Shanmugapati from Mamata Medical College, Khammam, sir. So today my guides are Dr. G. Malleshwara sir and Dr. K. Jagadish Babu sir. So I'm here to present a paper on comparative study of endoscopic evacuation versus conventional craniotomy in the treatment of supratentorial intracerebral hematoma. So which one is the best option to choose? So brief introduction. The spontaneous supratentorial intracranial hemorrhage affects almost 20% in 1 lakh people annually, and the mortality is almost about 40%. Although the clinical outcome is mainly determined by the patient initial presentation, early surgical intervention is crucial and urgent in selected patients. So in literature, patients with hematoma more than 1 centimeter from the cortical surface likely to have a favorable outcome from early surgery than those with the deep hematomas. So however, with the evolution of neuroendoscopes and hemostatic agents, surgical evacuation of ICH in deep hematomas is now safer and less invasive than before. So here we are presenting a series of patients with spontaneous supratentorial ICH who underwent endoscopic hematoma evacuation. So surgical evacuation of spontaneous intracranial hematoma is controversial because of traditional surgical approach sometimes causes further brain injury. So in our study, we are just going to discuss about neuroendoscopic hematoma evacuation versus decompressive craniectomy, the merits and demerits of each procedure. So the aim is the goal of the study is to evaluate the effectiveness and safety of neuroendoscopic group versus the craniotomy group to analyze the influence of the surgical outcomes by using Glasgow outcome scale, modified Rankin scoring, and the Glasgow Coma scale with the functional outcome scores. So the inclusion criteria, patient less than 70 years, supratentorial bleeds, Glasgow Coma scale more than 6, and the clot volume more than 30 ml. The exclusion criteria, patient age more than 70, infratentorial bleeds, intraventricular bleeds, and Glasgow Coma scale less than 6 are excluded. So procedure, the entry of point selection, the patient preparation. The entry was determined by location of the hemorrhage. The entry point could be either Cocos point, Keen's point, or Frazier's point, similar to the entry of ventriculostomy. The only difference is the trajectory, where in case of putamen ICH, the Cocos point is preferred. In temporal expansion, the Keen's point is preferred. In occipital extension, the Frazier's point is most preferred. So patients who had ICH in superficial location or who had a larger ICH for puncture, it was not necessary to fix their heads. The monitor and holder of the endoscopes were placed on the opposite side of the patient's chest. So endoscopic hematoma evacuation, a 2.5 into 3 centimeter burr hole was created. After tenting the dura, it was opened in a cruciate shape. A 1 centimeter cortical incision with a bipolar cauterization was made, and ventricular catheter was inserted, and the entry tract was created. After establishing a channel, the endoscope was introduced by hand into the space that was created by the hematoma. So most of the hematoma may gush out due to the high pressure. So we applied a 37 mm rod length endoscope, which is 18 centimeter in length, by Karlsruhe, Germany, to aspirate the residual hematoma. The sheath provides excellent visualization. So the deepest part of the hematoma should be removed first, and the sheath withdrawn gradually, facilitating the pushing of the residual part of the hematoma into the tip of the sheath. So if an active bleeder needs cauterization, the surgeon may use a bipolar forceps with endoscope held by an assistant or a holder. In our experience, hemostasis in typical hypertensive ICH can be achieved by hemostatic agents. So the postoperative care and radiological follow-up. Postoperative, the systolic blood pressure is strictly maintained at less than 160 mm, and the presence of excessive fluid is not allowed. So any morbidity and mortality were recorded, and the Glasgow Coma scale was recorded at 6 months and 3 months after the operation. This is pictures of endoscopic evacuations, the deeper ICH, and the picture of a decompressive craniectomy is done. So in the results we compared, 51 patients were randomly divided into 2 groups. All the patients are undergone neurological examination at the time of admission and after discharge. So GCS was assessed on the third post-op day and at the time of discharge. Glasgow outcome scale was analyzed at the time of follow-up after 3 months. The modified Rankin scale at the time of admission, discharge, and follow-up after the 3 months. So this is general data of the patients. So the cases where neuroendoscopic group contained 21 patients and craniotomy group contained 30. So the male is to female ratio, as is male is more predominant always in both the groups, and age is almost same with the mean age of 45 to 65 years. So the preoperative volume in neuroendoscopic group is 55 ml. In craniotomy group is 59 ml. The Glasgow Coma scale is 9 to 13 predicted in neuroendoscopic group, and craniotomy group is 8 to 12. The history of hypertension is almost 15 in neuroendoscopic group, and craniotomy group it's 23. So there are medical morbidities to the patients in each group considered with the endoscopy and craniotomy. So the most of the surgery within 8 hours is 12 out of 21 patients, and it's 16 out of 30 patients. So the entry point most happened is Cockers with 6 out of 21. In Keen's is 11, and Frazier's is 4. So there's a location of hematoma presented in each group, which most of the presentation is more presented with temporoparietal ICH, 10 in the neuroendoscopic group and 15 in the craniotomy group. So the operating time was significantly shorter in the neuroendoscopic group of 65 minutes compared to 174 minutes in the decompressive craniectomy group. So the mean neuro ICU stay in the neuroendoscopic group is 7.5 compared to the 14.5 in the conventional group. So the hematoma evacuation rate, complication, morbidity, mortality, and the rebleeding rates were compared in both the groups. So coming to the discussion, so intracranial in ICH is the most common neurological disorder with historically a poor prognosis and outcome. The prognosis influenced by several factors like from the origin of bleeding to the initial GCS presentation and hematoma volume. The data was analyzed from 51 patients, which was randomized and divided into 2 groups. So the ICH still represent a major cause of disability in patients who survive the stroke event. In addition, many series and guidelines have remained inconclusive regarding the best practice in managing ICH. So in our study, the most common age group is around 45 to 65 years. So regarding GCS is an independent predictor for outcome following ICH. Lower the GCS, poorer the outcome. GCS, however, often does not correlate with the size of the clot, and one of many low GCS in patients is small clot. A small clot is not an indication for surgery. However poor the GCS may be. So GCS between 9 to 12 demonstrated significantly improved outcome with surgery almost in individual studies and trials. So there are different surgical trials have used varying criteria, and distinction between the small, moderate and large size of clot is unclear. So in general, the clot volume of more than 30 ml indicates role of surgery, and clot volume more than 70 ml predicts fatal outcome. So in our study, if clot size is more than 70 ml, we kept the patient on decompressive craniectomy group, which showed a good outcomes. So early surgery within 8 hours showed good outcome compared to ultra early surgery within 4 hours are always associated with increased risk of rebleeding. So minimal invasive surgery is superior compared to decompressive craniectomy, especially in patients with age between 30, especially with volume between 30 to 60 ml, and those with superficial hematomas and hematoma volume between 25 to 50 ml, and the GCS score of more than 8. So the better outcome with minimal invasive surgery can be explained by unavoidable. We can avoid the parenchymal damage occurring with a classical craniotomy. Damage results from manipulation of viable brain tissue to assess the clot, cortical injury from the cortectomy. So inflammatory effects of the dissection also can be reduced. So all this can be safeguarded by minimal invasive approach that respect the integrity of a viable brain parenchyma. So in conclusion, endoscopic hematoma evacuation for spontaneous supratentorial hemorrhage is becoming a standard surgical procedure and promising clinical results as expected. We have found that using the endoscope can create an improved view and reduce bleeding and enhance time efficacies. So therefore, before being familiar with the endoscope and related instrumentation is the best way to create a better result and fewer complications. In case of poor GCS with more than 70 ml of blood, it's better to go with decompressive craniectomy compared to endoscope for promising results. Thank you.
Good. Dr. Shanmugara, you have completed on time.
Yes, thank you.
Any questions from the audience?
May I know what is the outcome in case of neuroendoscopy group as well as classical decompressive? I mean, how many patients are alive and in the different two groups?
Dr. Shrikant,
Mortality compared is more than depending upon the clot volume only, sir. This mortality is more than 70 ml. 70 ml, the mortality is increased in patients. So depending upon the main predictor is GCS and the clot volumes. Early doing the surgery earlier always showed a better results. Mortality is not assessed till now. That's one demerit.
Yeah.
Okay.
You have assessed the Glasgow outcome scale, no?
Yes, sir. Glasgow outcome scale Glasgow outcome scale is better with neuroendoscopic groups.
Yeah, in the Glasgow outcome scale, one of them is mortality, no?
Yes, sir.
You can say that. How many are there in the Glasgow outcome scale? One. That is mortality.
Okay, sir.
In the two groups.
Yeah, it's okay. Shanmug, okay, a good paper and good study.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, so we move on to the next paper. And Dr. Sudhi. Right, Amit? We'll move on to the second paper.
Am I audible, sir? Hello, am I audible?
Yeah. Yes. Go on. Go ahead, Sudhi.
Good morning, everyone, respected teachers and esteemed faculty. I'm going to present today on the topic of endovascular neurosurgery in LMIC setup, that is a low and middle income country setup. So all the cases have been done by myself. The machine which was used was the common cardiac cath lab machine. Most of the facilities have Philips FD10 or 20 cath lab machine. They will have a DSA and a roadmap facility inbuilt in them. There were no Dyna or Expert CT or a Vaso CT. All these cath labs were uniplane cath labs without 3D rotational angio. The hardware was acquired on demand. There was a 12 hours logistic buffer involved in this. The basic hardware nomenclature involved in endovascular neurosurgery is the diagnostic catheter, which can be a 5 French or a 6 French diagnostic catheter, a long sheath, a guiding catheter, a microcatheter, a microwire, balloon, stent, and flow diverters. So this is the basic image of a representative long sheath, which is used to support the other hardware. Another image of a guiding sheath. This is a representative stent with tines made up of nitinol. It's a braided stent. Another image showing a balloon, a super compliant balloon, and an image showing a micro catheter. The basic coil structure of the coils which is involved is a 3D coil which takes the shape of a basket. Filling and finishing coils which are used to plug in the gaps after the basket is made. This is the basic pattern of access till the site of the aneurysm. As you can see here, this is a long sheath which gives support to a guiding catheter, which in turn gives support to the microcatheter to advance till the site of the aneurysm. So aneurysm occlusion has been classified by RROC, which has a class 1, class 2, and class 3. Of note is that the class 3 RROC is more prone for rebleed and recurrence. So coming on to the cases, this is an ACOM aneurysm, grade 3 SAH, a very suitable neck for coiling. 2 coils were used and RROC class 1 ideal coiling was done. Another anterior communicating artery aneurysm with a good grade SAH, 4 coils were used and good obliteration was obtained and both the A2s are filling well. A slightly wider necked anterior communicating artery aneurysm with occlusion done as class 1 RROC. Another anterior communicating aneurysm with a 3.67 mm neck and a larger aneurysm which required 4 coils. Both the A2s are filling well and there is no evidence of any kind of spasm. A good grade ACOM aneurysm ideally occluded with 2 coils. A similar long oblong anterior communicating aneurysm. Another large anterior communicating aneurysm with one of the A2s originating from the neck of the aneurysm. And stent assisted coiling was done. In this case, a baby Leo stent was used and good obliteration obtained. ICA PCOM segment aneurysm, grade 3 SAH. This was an RROC2 grade coiling. 5 coils were used. Another superior hypophyseal large aneurysm with good obliteration, as you can see in the image. A superior hypophyseal segment grade 3 subarachnoid hemorrhage. 5 coils were used. Balloon assisted coiling was done. Basilar top aneurysms with ruptured basilar top, RROC2 class 2, 3 coils. Another basilar top with slightly wider neck, 4 coils were used. A pica aneurysm, which was a very poor grade subarachnoid hemorrhage, 5 coils were used to obliterate this. A P1, P2 aneurysm with neurogenic pulmonary edema and stunned myocardium. Patient was initially put on conservative management. She was brought out from the ventilator and stunned myocardium. And then the angio was done and 4 coils were used. And she's doing fine. Another right vertebral artery fusiform dissecting aneurysm with a grade 1 SAH. Parent artery occlusion was done after confirming in the angio that there is sufficient cross flow. As you can see, the pica is well preserved and also the anterior spinal artery is well preserved post parent artery occlusion. Intracoiling complications also can happen. Like for example, in this case, intra-procedural rupture occurred, and as you can see, the first loop of the coil is inside the aneurysm, and the heparin was reversed, and the aneurysm was kept on coiling. Post-procedure, patient needed a shunt, but she recovered. Another intra-procedural rupture where in a grade 4 SH, coils were introduced and the bleeding stopped. Sometimes in case there is a stroke, like for example, in this case of enterochoroidal aneurysm, the thrombectomy aspiration catheter was used and the TK3 perfusion obtained. In this case, a left vertebral artery aneurysm, flow diverter 6+ was used. It was an unruptured it was a ruptured aneurysm with around 15 days of gap between the procedure. A large giant unruptured supraclinoid aneurysm with flow diverter. Another large cavernous segment aneurysm, flow diverter was placed, Silk plus. A carotid cave and superior hypophyseal segment aneurysm, Silk plus flow diverter placed. And you can see the stasis which is happening in the aneurysm. AVM grade 3 onyx embolization done. You can see the onyx cast. Type A direct post-traumatic high flow CCF being occluded with a very long coil. Once the coil is there in place beyond the shunt in the cavernous sinus, a drop in the intra-fistula pressures will cause thrombosis. So we have to wait for the thrombosis. Serial images show the resolution of the proptosis. Another case, again a type A post-traumatic high flow CCF, serial sequence of images. Another case with the type C indirect high flow spontaneous CCF. This was accessed by means of a superior ophthalmic vein puncture and a direct coiling of the sac of the superior ophthalmic vein and the cavernous sinus junction was done. And this is the sequence of images showing excellent improvement in the patient. So the take-home message is that endovascular coiling can be done in a LMIC setup without compromising patient safety. Information can be compensated with a 3D CT angio for planning purposes if you have a uniplane cath lab, which is the common thing in all LMIC setups. And there should be careful selection of cases without bias, like for example, for middle cerebral artery aneurysms with a hematoma, the first option should be surgery, surgical clipping. Good grade anterior circulation patients can be given the option of surgery, coiling versus clipping, clipping versus coiling. And for posterior circulation, it should be the first option should be coiling. Thank you very much.
Congratulations, Dr. Sudhir, for your excellent work on endovascular intervention.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I think you are one of the very few neurosurgeons in Andhra Pradesh who are doing intervention neurosurgery work.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, it's
I
a
request
good
the next.
paper, Sudhir. Yeah. Okay, right. We'll move on to the next paper, paper 5, fifth paper. Dr. Vivek. We'll invite Vivek for this talk.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, screen is visible, sir?
Yeah, visible, Vivek. Go ahead.
Yes. Good morning, sir. My topic presentation is on brain metastasis from an unknown primary or primary brain tumor, diagnostic surprises and therapeutic dilemma. My guides are Dr. M.V. Vijaysekhar and Dr. Satyavara Prasad. So, introduction. The brain mets are by far the most common intracranial tumor, and their incidence is rising because of their increased cancer survival. Brain mets is increasingly common, affecting 20 to 40% of cancer patients. After diagnosis, survival is usually limited to the months in these patients. Brain mets of unknown primary are almost equal in numbers to the brain primaries and differ in sites of origin. The clinical and sometimes clinical features is similar to that of primary brain tumors. Here we present the few cases of lesions in the brain which are radiologically not compatible with brain mets. So now first case, the female 34-year-old presented with a weakness of one side of the body, and she has a several episode of headache and seizures before visiting to our outpatient department. And MRI shows the lesion in the left temporal left temporal lobe with perilesional edema, and there is a mass effect over the left lateral ventricle and third ventricle. In the and usually the single lesion was reported to be likely of glioma. In T1 image, there is a slight hyperintense cystic lesion with a solid component is present, and T2 there is hyperintensity is present. And after she got admitted, we planned for the surgery. She underwent a left temporal craniotomy for excision of tumor. But once biopsy was sent for histopathology, the biopsy of the lesion showed features of papillary adenocarcinoma metastatic deposits. This histopath slide photos where you can see the papillary patterns, which is more of correlating with the secondaries of adenocarcinoma. In some of the primary brain tumors like ependymoma or choroid plexus tumor and sometimes meningioma may be present with in histology shows as papillary patterns. But for this, in this case, the site is important. In most of the case, the brain tumor will be in the junction of the gray white, that corticomedullary junction. But it is in the deep seated, it is almost near the thalamic region. So clinically, we suspected as initially as a glioma, but after the histopathology report, this came as a metastatic deposits. So once we got the biopsy report, we got workup for the primary, but investigation failed to reveal any primary cancer site. So patient was referred to radiation oncology and medical oncologist to start on a concurrent chemotherapy and radiation to the brain. But unfortunately, she passed away shortly thereafter, that 3 months from the initial presentation and 2 months after the tumor resection. Now coming to the second case, and this was male patient, 53-year-old, complaints with altered sensorium, and also he presented with a raised ICP features like headache, vomiting, and seizures. And MRI shows with we had gotten a spectroscopy also shows interaxial lesions in the periventricular white matter or the right parietal lesion with the perilesional edema, which is suggestive of space occupying lesion, single lesion of glioma. And patient underwent a parietal craniotomy for excision of the tumor. For this case also, as I mentioned before, the most common site for the primary for the brain mets will be the corticomedullary junction. This also presented as a deep-seated, is almost near the periventricular region. Only after the confirmation of the biopsy, we come to know that patient is a secondaries. So once the patient was recovered, as usual, we started on radiation with refer to the radiation oncology and with the whole brain radiation concurrent chemotherapy. For the further follow-up for the 1 year, the patient didn't show any of the recurrence of the symptoms. So right now, patient is asymptomatic, but still, and we couldn't make out the primary. And this is third patient. Is also male patient, 50-year-old, present with the numbness of the one side of the body, and he doesn't present with any of the raised ICP. Only headache he was present, no symptoms of vomiting or seizures. And MRI shows the intraaxial lesion, irregular thick walled ring, anansic lesion, and there is a central necrosis also involving the left thalamus. So this features more of glioblastoma multiforme. And as he went for the craniotomy and transcortical approach for excision of the tumor, once a biopsy report has come, this also shows the metastatic deposits of adenocarcinoma. And subject once the patient was recovered from the surgery, he was sent for the workup for the primary. We had done routine blood investigation and peripheral smear, and also for HRCT and contrast CT abdomen. We couldn't find any primary site. So we started on we referred to the radiation oncologist for the whole brain radiation. And patients post-op from 6 months, patient was followed up, and there is no any further recurrence of the symptoms. On conclusion, the optimal treatment regimens in glioblastoma and brain mets differ greatly. If the diagnosis is erroneous, neither group of the patient will receive the care they needed for improved survival and quality of life. Given the similar nature of both the symptoms and the presenting appearance of the cancer brain lesions, the diagnoses are easily interchanged. It is therefore extremely important to exercise caution when diagnosing the cancerous brain lesions. Pathologic evidence should be obtained whenever possible. So, thank you, sir.
Yes, Vivek, good paper. And now the paper is open for questions. And any questions from audience? Okay, no questions, and we'll move on to the next paper. Okay, thank you, Vivek.
Thank you, sir.
Next is Dr. Hanuman Naik.
Yeah. Hanuman Naik, please go ahead.
Good morning, sir. Today my topic is comparison of cystinostomy and decompressive craniectomy. 1 minute, sir. Hello, am I audible, sir?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, sir. My topic is comparison of cystinostomy and decompressive craniectomy in the management of traumatic brain injury. Introduction, sir. Traumatic brain injury is a major public health concern worldwide. It causes primary and secondary brain injury. Primary brain injury depends on the impact. Secondary brain injury is caused by the brain swelling and increase in the ICP and decrease in the cerebral perfusion. The goal of the traumatic brain injury treatment is to avoid the secondary injuries to the traumatized brain by reducing the swelling and ICP and maintain the blood supply and oxygen delivery. Meticulous control of the intracranial pressure can improve outcome of the patients after traumatic brain injury. Decompressive hemicraniectomy is the most significant step in the management of traumatic brain injury. Kocher in 1901 first described decompressive hemicraniectomy. Harvey Cushing in 1908 published the first results of Kocher's doctrine. Since then, decompressive craniectomy remained as a surgical technique of choice, but decompressive craniectomy and the need for second surgery in the form of cranioplasty has many complications. This alternative surgery procedures which are Robbins spaces, they are seen around the vessels, traversing from the cisterns into the brain, lymphatic system. CSF from the cisterns communicate with the parenchyma through Victor-Robbins spaces. So evacuation of CSF from the basal cisterns is effective method to decrease intracranial pressure. So evacuation of CSF from the basal cistern is effective to decrease intracranial pressure. Opening of the basal cistern is a well-recognized and effective method of decreasing intracranial pressure. Cystonostomy, novel technique which incorporates the discipline of skull base and microvascular approach of opening the subarachnoid cisterns has been described. In our study, we studied prospectively outcomes of the cystonostomy and decompressive craniectomy in the management of traumatic brain injuries. Aims and objectives of the study to compare the clinical and radiological outcomes and of the cystonostomy and decompressive craniectomy in the management of traumatic brain injury. Materials and method, patient selection by traumatic brain injury patient who needs surgical management and fulfill the inclusion criteria from March 2019 to September 2020 was studied. Inclusion criteria: age more than 18 years and less than 65 years, with GCS more than or equal to 4. GCS 3 were not operated, sir. Brain parenchymal contusions with mass effect and midline shift, acute SDH with mass effect and midline shift, and traumatic SH with mass effect and midline shift, and post-traumatic diffuse edema with mass effect and midline shift. Exclusion criteria: age less than 18 years and more than 65 years. and GCS3, extradural hemorrhage, and non-traumatic SH, non-traumatic intraparenchymal bleeds, and acute infarcts with mass effects. Methodology: all the patients with a traumatic brain injury patient who fulfill the criteria were enrolled in the study. Computed tomography of the skull will be done for every patient as per our institute protocol. Based on the clinical findings, Glasgow Coma Scale and CT findings, they will be assessed for requirement of surgical management. They were categorized into two groups, decompressive craniectomy group and cystinostomy group. All the patients were randomized preoperatively. Randomization sequences were generated before starting the study. All patients who participated in the study were reassessed after 1 month and 3 months of the follow-ups. Cystinostomy. We placed the patient in the reverse Trendelenburg position and head turned to the opposite side to expose the hemocranium. Incision, we used to place the large standard incision as per the decompressive craniectomy for the cystinostomy patients also. After taking musculocutaneous flap and craniotomy, dural opening under the microscope, a Sylvian fissure is gently dissected with the microscope. Then subfrontal retraction will be applied. Olfactory tract, optic nerve, and ICA will be identified. After that, intraoptic systems and opticocarotid systems will be opened. Opening of the opticocarotid and lateral carotid systems is performed. Followed by lamina terminalis will be opened. After lamina terminalis open, brain will be relaxed. Followed by membrane of Lilliquist membrane will be opened through widening of the opticocarotid window or the lateral carotid windows. This is followed by the hemostasis and duroplasty will be done. Bone flap will be replaced in the cystinostomy group and closure of the musculocutaneous flaps. Results, sir. Out of the total 44 cases were performed, 26 underwent decompressive craniectomy and 18 underwent cystinostomy. In decompressive craniectomy group and cystinostomy group, mean age is 48.6 and cystinostomy group is 42.5. GCS at the time of presentation is 5 and cystinostomy group is 5.2. Marshall CT score is assessed preoperatively. It is 4 in decompressive craniectomy group and cystinostomy group. It is 4.6. Both the groups are comparable, sir. Intra-op ICP monitoring will be was done. So decompressive craniectomy group, mean ICP after first burr hole is 28.6 and it is cystinostomy group is 28.1. After craniotomy, total craniotomy in decompressive craniectomy group it is 14.8 and cystinostomy group it is after opening the systems in cystinostomy group it is 6.4. There is more decrease of ICP in the cystinostomy group after opening the systems. Duration of the surgery it is 3.2 and cystinostomy group is 3.6. Slightly less in cystinostomy groups.
Yeah, you should stick on your time.
So in post-op period, decompressive craniotomy group, number of days on ventilator is 5.6. Cystinostomy group it is 4.8. And number of days of ICU stay it is 9.8 and 7.2. Less in cystinostomy group. Post-op complications, wound sepsis and CSF leak is more in the decompressive craniectomy group. One patient developed osteomyelitis in the cystinostomy. GCS at the time of discharge, mean GCS is 10.4 in decompressive craniectomy group and cystinostomy group it is 11.6. Mortality 23%, 6 patients in decompressive craniectomy group and 4 patients in cystinostomy group. Glasgow outcome scale at the follow-up 3 months it is 3.2 in and pre-op and post-op CT of the cystinostomy patients, sir. Opening of the cystons will be seen in the immediate post-op period. Discussion. Most significant step in the management of traumatic brain injury has been made with the introduction of decompressive hemicraniectomy. It is an accepted concept that the evacuation of CSF from the basal systems is an effective method for achieving a relaxed brain during a microsurgical approach. Ip Chirian in 2009 presented a cystinostomy, a new method for the control of ICP in traumatic brain injury. This technique incorporates knowledge of the skull. In our study, patient who underwent cystinostomy showed improved clinical outcomes. Cystinostomy showed decreased days of requirement.
Sir, we are lagging in the time. Please make it fast.
Cystinostomy showed a significant reduction of ICP after opening of the cystons. Postoperative complications like CSF leak are less with the cystinostomy group. By opening the basal cystus lamina terminalis, and cystinostomy enables catheter to drain both the cysternal and ventricular compartments. This reverses the shift of fluid to the intraparenchymal compartments, thus alleviating the brain swelling. Conclusion: cystinostomy is a safe and a feasible procedure for the surgical management of traumatic brain injury. Our single center prospective data indicates that cystinostomy was beneficial for the management of traumatic brain injury and is associated with better clinical outcome. Cystinostomy requires, cystinostomy requires expertise in skull base and microsurgical. Opening up systems associated with challenging and requires thorough anatomic knowledge and enough surgical skills. So, in every center, it can't be possible to do cystinostomy for every traumatic brain injury patient. They are my references.
Okay. It's done, Hanuman. Your paper is done. Any? Yeah, it's a paper is open for questions. Any questions from audience? 1 or 2 questions.
Dr. Hanma, I am Dr. Vijay Sekhar. Nice study, but one thing is, in routine elective cases, dissection in the basal cystus is okay. But in a severe TBI, where the brain, you expect already some brain edema and bulge, it will be difficult to dissect. So, how you have sorted out this problem? It's definitely a good alternative.
There is a problem in doing. So there is a problem in doing cystinostomy in traumatic patients. There is blood will be there, edema will be there.
Yes.
But our faculty were expertise in doing this.
Yeah,
Okay.
in certain possible cases only. Okay, it's limited. Certain limitations are there.
Selection of cases are important. And for this, you should nibble low to the temple. Good, good paper.
One more question from me.
Sir.
Do you have a microscope in the emergency OT?
Yes, sir.
So you use it in all traumatic cases?
We had
Pardon?
We had microscope in emergency OT also.
Okay, good. That's a luxury.
A good paper, and then congratulations for it. And then we'll move on to the next paper, 7th paper, Dr. Nagaraju. Nagaraju, are you there? Dr. Nagaraju.
Hello.
Yeah. Nagaraju, please go ahead now.
Sir, good morning, sir.
Yeah, good morning.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. My presentation is on dilemmas in the management of cerebellar hemorrhagic stroke, sir. My guides are Dr. Satyanarayana Murthy, sir, Dr. Sheshadri Shekhar, sir, Chandrasekhar, sir, Hanma, sir, Hensley, sir, Praveen, sir, and Rohit Reddy, sir. Sir, the introduction is cerebellar hemorrhages, which are of spontaneous in origin, account to about 5 to 13% of all intracranial spontaneous hemorrhages. According to the data available, the surgical mortality remains 20 to 50% in spontaneous cerebellar hemorrhages. The reason for management of cerebellar hematomas being dubious is insufficiency of available literature. The literature collectively do not suggest surgical intervention straightforward, and the controversy of managing spontaneous cerebellar hematoma still persists between the initial medical management versus the immediate surgical intervention. The present study focuses on reviewing the available literature on management of spontaneous cerebellar hematomas and comparing the data available with the present study to endeavor framing management guidelines for cerebellar hemorrhagic stroke in our institute. The aims and objectives are to analyze the various management guidelines of spontaneous cerebellar hematomas, to identify the factors which lead to deterioration of initially stable patient during presentation and focus on taking measures to counteract those factors, to assess the clinical and radiological predictors of outcome, to identify easy applicable guidelines in management of cerebellar hemorrhagic stroke, to evaluate surgical and medical outcome following evacuation of cerebellar hematomas. The material and methods we have, this is a prospective study done on patients who presented with cerebellar hemorrhagic stroke to the Department of Neurosurgery and Neurology in Guntur Government General Hospital from October 2019 to March 2019 with a sample size of 30 members. The inclusion criteria was patients of all age groups and patients with spontaneous cerebellar hemorrhagic stroke. The exclusion criteria was patient with poor GCS of GCS3 and dilated and non-reacting pupils, patients with associated debilitating medical comorbidities such as renal failure, metabolic complications and bleeding disorders, patients who already are on ventilator support and who are vital unstable, traumatic cerebellar bleeds, and patients who are associated with brain tumors and vascular malformations, and cerebellar infarcts and aneurysms were excluded in the criteria. The results in this study, 30 patients were taken after they are satisfied in all inclusion and exclusion criteria. The patients in the study are grouped depending upon the various parameters such as age, sex, clinical features, time of presentation, GCS depending on the grade of the compression over the fourth ventricle, and depending upon the clot size and the volume, depending on the presence or absence of the hydrocephalus, depending on the treatment given and depending on the outcome. So according to the age distribution, we have taken 30 members. The age of the patients and the age less than 30 years were only one person, 31 to 40 years were 2 persons. The maximum age group was in 51 to 60 years in our study. This is the pie diagram which is depicting the age group which is of 51 to 60 years, which is 40%. The sex distribution, which are mostly seen in our patients, 18% of them were males and 12% were females. Even the pie diagram is depicting the same. The clinical features showed that the patient presented with headache, loss of consciousness, vomitings, ataxia, limb paralysis, vertigo, cranial nerve palsy, speech problems and diplopia. And the headache, most of them presented with headache, and 18 members of them were having a headache which is of 60%, and the loss of consciousness was about 40%, and the vomitings were about 33.3%. Limb ataxia was seen in 16.6%. Limb paralysis was seen in 16.6%. The vertigo was seen in 13.3%, and cranial nerve palsy were seen in 10% of the people, along with speech problems in 10% and diplopia in 6.6%. The comorbidities, the basic comorbidities that are noted in our patients were hypertension, diabetes, coronary artery diseases, which were hypertension was seen in most of the patients, which are of about 12%, that is 40% of the total, which can be seen in the graph. The time of presentation was within 24 hours and after 24 hours. Most of them presented after 24 hours, which is 18 members were present who presented to us were after 24 hours. GCS, most of them on admission, the Glasgow Coma Scale was 13 to 15. 14 members were in 13 to 15 range, and 9 to 12 GCS score was seen in 11 members, and in 5 members only 3 to 8 the GCS was very poor. The grading of fourth ventricle, the grading of the fourth ventricle was given either on grade 1, grade 2 and grade 3, either based on the grading of the compression over the fourth ventricle. If it is normal, in 4 patients it was normal, and in 18 patients it was moderately compressed, which is about 60% of the study patients had moderate compression, and 26.66%, that is 8 members were having severe compression. The clot size, we have measured the clot size, which is of in 2 groups, which is less than 3 centimeters in 2 or more than 3 centimeters. Less than 3 centimeters was seen in 12 patients, and more than 3 centimeters was seen in 18 members of the patients. The clot volume was measured by less than 15 ml or more than 15 ml. Less than 15 ml was seen in 18 members of the patients, and more than 15 ml was seen in 12 patients. Associated hydrocephalus was present in 18 members, and it was absent in 12 members. The correlation with the GCS with the fourth ventricular status, in grade 1 ventricular compression, the mean clot volume was 7 and the mean clot diameter was 2.4, and the number of patients were 4. And the grade 2, the mean clot volume was 16 and the mean clot diameter was 4.20. The number of patients were 18 members, and most of the study group members were in this grade 2. And the grade 3, the mean clot volume is 27 and the mean clot diameter was 5.30. The total number of patients in this group are 8 members. The treatment given to these patients were either conservative, suboccipital craniectomy and evacuation of hematoma, or only CSF drainage alone, or CSF drainage and surgical evacuation of the hematoma. The conservative management was given in 10 patients. 13 patients received suboccipital craniectomy and evacuation of hematoma. 4 members.
It is time up. We are lagging very behind the time.
Okay, Nagaraju, conclude in short, I think. That would be better.
The summary and conclusion: the dilemmas in the indications for surgical intervention in spontaneous cerebellar hematomas still persist because of the inadequate literature and the data available. A series of collected data and randomized trial and the correlation of data available may outline the management protocol, and this study does not focus on promoting the significance. The commonest age group in our study was 51 to 60 years, with a male predilection of 60% being the males. The commonest complaint was headache. So, as the center is tertiary hospital, the most of the patients will be referred to from primary health care centers. Delay in presentation after acute onset symptoms was noted. 60% patients presented with after 24 hours.
Nagaraju, okay. Yes,
so this is the last slide.
I'm running late. Okay, anyway, it's a good paper, and then it's a take-home message is anything is there, and then we'll take-home message. I think cerebellar hemorrhagic stroke, CSF diversion and evacuation of the hematoma is the best option nowadays. Okay.
Yes.
Right. Very good paper, Nagaraju, and then we'll move on to the next paper.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Right. And Dr. Sriram, and I invite Dr. Sriram for his paper. Sriram, are you there? Sriram,
sir, I'm
are you
there?
Yeah, go ahead, Sriram.
Yes, sir.
And stick on to your time.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes. Zoom open. Sir, is it visible, sir?
No. Not visible.
Sriram, any difficulty, technical problem?
1 minute, sir.
Yeah. Shall we go for next paper, 9th? And then we'll invite him after this.
Yes,
Yeah,
sir,
Swaroop, are you ready? Hema Swaroop.
Yes, sir, I am ready, sir.
Yeah, go ahead with your paper. Swaroop.
Sir, I am presenting a study of pediatric TB at Tertiary Care Center. That is our Andhra Medical College, King George Hospital, under the guidance of Dr. K. Sachvar sir and M. V. Vijayashekhar sir. Coming to the introduction, traumatic brain injury in children is a significant cause of morbidity and mortality worldwide. And falls are the most common type of injury, followed by motor vehicle accident, related accidents, and child abuse. My aims and objectives of this study are to elucidate the various modes of injury, prognostic factors, complications, and outcome in the traumatic brain injury in the pediatric population, sir. Materials and methods. This is an observational study with patients with traumatic brain injury of the patients less than 18 years, managed in our department of neurosurgery over a period of 2 years, that is from January 2019 to December 2020. Our study includes the detailed history, examination, including GCS and pupillary size. As children, we can assess the condition of the child easily with the pupillary size. Radiological findings and management were assessed. The outcome of all these patients were assessed by Glasgow Outcome Scale. Coming to the results, 515 patients are assessed between the age of 515 patients are assessed between the age of 1 day and 18 years, comprising of 320 males and 195 females. The common mode of injury in our study group is fall, followed by road traffic accidents, followed by assault and others. Majority of our patients had a GCS of 13 to 15, which is similar to the age group, adult population. Relationship of the age, sex with the outcome. That is, most of our patients are usually, 5 and age group between 6 to 12 have a good outcome. Children between 13 to 18 has a little poorer outcome compared to the age group between 1 day to 12 years. In our study, there is no difference between the male and female population for the outcome. Coming to the relation of mode of trauma and GCS with the outcome, most commonly mode of trauma in our group is fall, which has got the good prognosis. And the next is the road traffic accident, which has got the poor outcome. And coming to the GCS assessment, as with the similar lines with the adult population, our group also has a poor outcome with GCS less than 8. Coming to the pupillary size, our group has poor outcome with anisocoria, and all the patients with fixed and dilated patients have expired. And the CT findings, most common presentation in our group is fractures, which is from the simple fractures to deposit bone fractures. And the next most common finding is the normal finding. And the other findings are EDH, SDH, and pneumocapillus also seen. the best prognosis is observed in the group of a fracture group, that is simple to depressive bone fractures. And a relationship of the mode of treatment with outcome. Most of our patients are managed conservatively, and the most common type of intervention we did was the fracture elevation or debridement, which has got a good prognosis with our intervention. And the worst prognosis is associated with fracture debridement with the underlying hematoma or contusion removal, which has got the poorer outcome. Relationship of associated injuries with the outcome. Most common associated injuries with our pediatric head injuries are usually the facial bone fractures, which carries a good prognosis. And the next most common is abdominal injuries, which is the next best prognosis. And the limb and the chest injuries associated carry the poor prognosis in our group. Coming to the outcome, we have assessed all the children by Glasgow outcome scale, in which normal patients carry the best prognosis. Of 423 patients of 515 patients have been discharged with Glasgow outcome scale with 5, and 29 patients died in our series. Coming to the discussion, compared to the other various studies worldwide, our series, there is no difference between the poor outcome in children below 5 and 5 to 12 years, but poorer outcome is noted in children greater than 12 years. The most common mode of injury in our group is fall, followed by road traffic accidents. Poor outcome is noted with GCS less than 8, and poor outcome is associated with anisocoria. The most of our patients showed simple fractures than their normal CT findings, and the poor outcome is associated with fracture associated with other brain parenchymal injuries. Most of the patients improved with conservative management and minimum interventions, that is debridement or elevation of the fracture. Commonly associated injuries are facial bone fractures, very poor prognosis associated with limb and chest injuries. Conclusion, majority of the children who suffer from the traumatic brain injury do well, although it is still continues to be a significant cause of morbidity and mortality in them. The outcome is directly related to neurological status in which they present to the hospital. This is my conclusion. Thank you.
Swarup, it's a good paper. Now the paper is open for discussion. Any questions? If no questions from audience, I think
it is not. Sir,
anything? Yeah, shall we invite Sriram?
Sriram.
For his, actually he could not. Hello, Sriram? Sriram, are you there?
Sir, screen మీద మీది పేరు అని చూపిస్తుంది సార్.
I have to stop the screen.
Screen మీద మీ నేమ్ ఏం చూపిస్తుంది సార్?
Purpose, sir?
Sir, hello.
What to do?
Okay. A short, very short presentation.
Okay. So I think Sriram is not there. So we'll conclude the session. Huh?
Okay.
Who is the
Amit? Yeah. Anyway, it's a good I thank organizers for giving us to this opportunity to chair this session, and I thank and congratulate all the team of IP Neurocon and the organizers for excellent conducting this program. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bharatkar and Dr. Amit, and thank all the speakers. Now we will move on to the next session.